Maybe one night after school, after work, after anything, you were probably alone as well. You asked the question, not aloud or a super extreme question, not to anyone else, but instead simply a quiet, uninvited arrival of the question in the middle of something completely ordinary, something completely habitual. What is any of this actually for? Why this life and not any other life? Whether the choices I'm making are actually mine, or is this just the path of least resistance dressed as some sort of intention of living? You may not have labeled it as existentialism in the moment, but that is pretty much exactly what it was. Three men, the three philosophers, spent their entire lives trying to answer that question. This isn't a limited to men thing, however. Simone de Beauvoir has one of the best takes on existentialism. Unfortunately, I'm just not covering her take in this video. These philosophers arrived at completely different conclusions somehow, and none of them were wrong, but none of them were entirely right either. And the argument between them, in my opinion, is still one of the most honest and explanatory conversations about what it means to be alive without a manual to follow. First off, I'm going to talk about Soren Kierkegaard. He's very highly mentioned on this channel, but he was a Danish philosopher who wrote in about the 1840s, around that time, who was quite deeply uncomfortably religious and deeply, again, uncomfortably honest about what genuine faith actually required of a person. He watched the Christianity around him and found it to be a hollow practice, nothing real as compared to genuine Christianity. Not because God wasn't real. Kierkegaard believed God was so real with a ferocity that he made the comfortable Sunday Christians of Copenhagen look like tourists. But instead, because the faith that they had practiced required nothing of anyone. It was an inherited and assumed and a socially convenient practice for most people at that time, and had never been tested against the moment where it made no sense to the person to follow it. So Kierkegaard's answer to that, one of the most widely regarded answers, is the leap. Just take the leap. Not a rational conclusion of taking a leap, but instead a simple movement towards God that reason itself is impossible to justify and therefore cannot protect you from. Abraham raising the knife over his son, not because it made sense, but because of faith, because if it was genuine, he must survive the moment where it made no sense at all. However, before that leap, Kierkegaard described three stages of existence, right? There was the aesthetic stage, which was living for pleasure and societal hierarchy and sensation and the next thing. There was the ethical stage, which was living by duty and living by moral obligations or following, again, social hierarchies of virtue and the contract of being social. And then the third stage, the religious stage, which was the stage beyond both the other two, where the individual stands alone, completely alone before God, and makes the leap that nobody else can make for them. Most people, however, Kierkegaard stated, never make it past that first stage. They never choose to leave it. Most people are still simply chasing the next best thing. So that's Kierkegaard's opinion, right? Next, I want to talk about Jean-Paul Sartre. He read Kierkegaard, as a matter of fact, and kept his framework, yet threw out Kierkegaard's idea of God entirely. And that might be controversial, but that's just all Sartre said. Sartre's formulation was simple, yet so devastating. It was the fact that existence precedes essence. You are not born with a nature or a purpose or a predetermined self waiting to be discovered by the mystical Lord above. Instead, you are thrown into existence without any instruction manual, and the self that you do become is the product of every single choice you make from that moment forwards. And it sounds like freedom to some, which it may be. However, to others, it may also sound like terror, which again, it may be. It is both. Because if your existence precedes essence, then you cannot blame your nature in any sense. You cannot blame your upbringing or your circumstances or your country or your God or your environment or your history for who you are as a person now. You chose every morning, every decision. The life that you are living is the entirely accumulated weight of choices that you made, you chose to make. And many of those made, you feel like a different person. However, a lot of those as well, you made those choices while pretending that you had no choice to make that choice. So Jean-Paul Sartre labeled this as the idea of bad faith. It is the waiter who performs the role of a waiter so completely well, he forgets he chose to be the waiter. It is the person who says inherently they have no choice, when what they mean is that they chose the path of least resistance and found it much easier for them to acknowledge the choosing. You yourself are a free human being. You are radically and nauseously and inescapably free in a sense. Actually, not even in any sense, in every sense. And most of the time, you are using that freedom to pretend that you aren't. You are standing in a cage with one singular bar, which you could leave at any point, and choosing to hold on to that bar and saying that you cannot leave. Now, third and foremost, we have Albert Camus. Again, not last or not least, but he is the last I'm going to talk about here. Camus, one of my favorite writers of all time, rejected the existentialist label, but belongs in this conversation, in my opinion, more than any other philosopher. I think his take on existentialism, regardless of the fact that he didn't label it as existentialism, is what makes it so impactful and so meaningful. Camus' question was completely different from Jean-Paul Sartre's. It was not what you do with your freedom, but instead what do you do with the meaningless instead of the freedom. It's quite polarizing, right? The universe itself is not a hostile place. Instead, the universe is completely indifferent to your living. It offers absolutely no response to the human demand for meaning or any sort of sense of purpose or some structures that make the whole thing make sense. And the silence is total, yet somehow so permanent. And Camus decided to label this as the absurd. He decided to revolt and call the collision between the human being and the human need for meaning and the world's complete refusal and indifference to provide it the absurd nature of the universe. So Kierkegaard's answer was inherently the leap. It was to reach for God and trust what reason is unable to justify in every sense. Jean-Paul Sartre's answer was creation. Make the meaning yourself in your own life. You have the freedom to live, so why don't you make the choices of living yourself? Own the freedom and build the self through deliberate choice. Camus answered and said both of these were evasions of the true existentialist crisis. The leap is a philosophical suicide, one of Camus' biggest topics. It is reaching for a comfort that the evidence itself does not support. The existentialist creation of meaning is just a mere sophisticated version of the exact same thing, replacing God with the self as the source of meaning, which still does require you to believe that meaning exists somewhere. So all Camus said was to revolt. That was his entire answer. Stay inside the absurd and do not resolve it ever. Do not reach for the leap or reach for the self-created meaning. Instead, all you must do for the universe to treat you or for the universe to see you as existing is live fully and honestly in the knowledge that the universe owes you nothing and will never see you and will give you absolutely nothing, and just accept it regardless. Say yes to that fact. Live as if the universe will never see you, hoping that eventually it will, even though you know it never will. And that doesn't mean it's a rational take. This is honestly probably the most irrational take out of the whole video, but I think the alternative is a half-life spent waiting for the guarantee that will never arrive. And I agree with Camus completely. Sisyphus pushing that boulder up the hill forever and watching it roll back and pushing it again is the exact definition of seeing the universe providing you nothing and yet fighting to make your own meaning. So Camus said and completely stated that we must imagine Sisyphus as a happy man rolling that boulder up the hill and watching it roll back down and doing it again and again and again, even knowing that never will the universe give him the option to stop. So these three men, these three such influential philosophers, had the same exact question, the same exact ideology that they had to answer to, yet somehow came with completely polarizing answers. Kierkegaard, again, he told you to leap, irrationally, just jump, take the leap, trust in God. Reach for something beyond your obsession, beyond your observation of the world, and trust what you are unable to prove. Jean-Paul Sartre told you to own it. I don't know why I say his full name, but neither of the others. I don't know, I just like to say Jean-Paul. But he told you to be free, because you are free, and you have the freedom. You have always had the freedom, and the life that you are living in is the one that you choose every single day, every single minute, every single choice. So Camus says revolt, and to stay in the uncertainty of the world, aware of the fact that you have no guarantees from life, and say yes to it regardless. I've read all three. I've I've tried to analyze, but I've again tried to understand. Nobody can ever understand someone else completely, but I've read and I've attempted to analyze all three, and I still have no clue which one is right, and I don't think I ever will have the answer. I'm not sure whether the question of which one is right is the useful question, even in this case. I think the useful question is simply, which one of these ideologies are you living by without knowing it? Just right now, which one of these can you completely accept as your reality? Now, this idea of existentialism, this is just a little extension at the end. You can skip this, but I think the idea of existentialism has been covered so many times in such different ways by so many philosophers. So I'm going to name a few here for you. Again, in this video, we went over Kierkegaard, we went over Camus, and we went over Sartre. But like I mentioned, Simone de Beauvoir, she was a genius. She talked about the fact that freedom is not given, but instead taken, and existentialism applied to that specific condition of women and oppression is one of the most politically consequential applications of that philosophy. There's also, I don't know, Heidegger, for instance, or Nietzsche. Heidegger talked about being towards death, the authenticity, but I talked about that in a previous video, so I think you should go watch that too, obviously. But and then Nietzsche, of course, talked about the death of God and what follows, and the Übermensch was not a powerful fantasy, but instead the person willing to create the values in place of the absence of the inherited ones, right? I think I made a video on Nietzsche's Übermensch too, but it's got Kanye West involved, so it's a little bit of a moving topic, right? But there's so many different names that you can mention, like I said, in this entire video. So I recommend you find one, and just as Seneca said, instead of jumping from author to book, you should find one author, you should find one writer, stick to them for a little bit of time, for a long time as a matter of fact, and understand their work completely before moving on. I would recommend most people to start off with Camus or Sartre because they're a lot more absorbable than the likes of Heidegger or Nietzsche in a sense, but it's really up to you. That is the choice that you must make that Sartre told you you must.